Section 1, Trump Accounts, State of the Union and a Capitalist UBI Idea. The episode opens on a lighter note before turning hard into geopolitics, and Brad Gerstner joins in place of David Friedberg, and the host immediately asks about Gerstner's moment at the State of the Union, where President Trump gave him a shout-out tied to the Trump Accounts initiative. Gerstner says the recognition was a genuine surprise. He explains that the mention wasn't in the speech and that the president added it, which made the moment feel both spontaneous and meaningful. He describes the night less as a partisan spectacle than as an expression of American continuity, calling the annual address one of the country's enduring democratic traditions. The deeper point is the scale of the savings account program. Gerstner says the effort is now signing up over 100,000 kids a day, that millions of kids have already claimed accounts, and that nearly 30 million kids in America are eligible for at least 250 if they claim one. He says the accounts are set to go live on July 4th, framing the program as a way to bring Main Street America into the game of capitalism by giving families direct ownership exposure to leading American companies. The political symbolism matters, but the economic thesis matters more, broadening access to asset ownership at a young age. That leads to one of the more intriguing policy riffs of the episode. The host suggests that while the accounts are not intended as universal basic income, they could evolve into something adjacent to a wealth-building compact for the next generation. He floats the idea of an equity-based. Section 2, the Iran oil shock and why markets are so nervous. The conversation then pivots to Iran, where the hosts focus less on battlefield tactics than on the immediate economic consequences of conflict. The central market signal is oil. Brent crude, the benchmark they used throughout the discussion, had an extraordinary run. It spiked to 84 on Friday, jumped as high as roughly 119 on Monday, dropped back toward 84, then surged again after attacks on commercial vessels in the Strait of Hormuz. By the time of recording, Brent is around 99, though the host notes it will almost certainly have moved again by the time listeners hear the episode. To give the shock historical context, the host compares the move to prior oil crises. He recalls the 1978-79 shock, when Americans waited in gas lines according to their license plate numbers, and points to later peaks. Around 100 during the Gulf War period, roughly 216 in today's dollars in 2008 during the peak oil era, and about 115 after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, equivalent to around 133 in current dollars. His argument is not that this is unprecedented, but that it is significant enough to trigger fears of a broader macro dislocation. The strategic concern is the Strait of Hormuz. New reporting cited in the episode says Iran's new supreme leader is keeping the strait closed as leverage, while a Wall Street Journal source argues that reopening it could require ground troops. Prediction markets add to the anxiety. Polymarket is quoted as assigning a 27% chance of U.S. forces entering Iran by the end of March and 57% by year-end, whether or not. Section 3, Off-Ramps, Escalation Risks, and the Case for Declaring Victory. The strongest substantive debate in the Iran portion centers on whether the U.S. should now seek an off-ramp or continue escalating. David Sachs lays out the clearest de-escalation case. He argues that Iran's army, navy, and air force have already been massively degraded, making this a good time to declare victory and get out. In his telling, the market's preferred outcome is obvious: demonstrate that objectives were met, then stop before tactical success turns into strategic overreach. Sachs is especially focused on the downside scenarios. He warns that if Iran's oil and gas infrastructure is hit further, Tehran has already threatened retaliatory strikes against Gulf energy assets. He points to a recent blast at a giant oil depot in Oman and argues that attacks on broader Gulf infrastructure could make reopening the Strait of Hormuz almost irrelevant if production itself is crippled. Worse still, he raises the region's dependence on desalination plants. He says roughly 70% of Riyadh relies on desalinated water and that about 100 million people across the Arabian Peninsula depend on it. If those facilities become targets, the humanitarian consequences could be catastrophic. You could literally render the Gulf almost uninhabitable. He extends the warning to Israel. Although he concedes Israel's infrastructure is more hardened and it is less vulnerable than nearby Gulf states, he says a long conflict could exhaust missile defenses and produce damage on a scale not previously seen in Israeli history. In the most extreme case, further escalation could even raise the possibility of nuclear use, which he describes as truly catastrophic. The host partially agrees, though. Section 4, Why China May Be the Hidden Variable in the Iran Conflict. One of the most original claims in the episode is Chamath's insistence that all roads lead to China. He argues that Iran and even Venezuela should not be analyzed in isolation, but as pieces of a larger strategic board on which the decisive player is Beijing. His thesis is that oil disruption in the Middle East matters far more to China than to the United States, and that fact creates leverage for Trump ahead of an anticipated summit with Xi Jinping. Gerstner amplifies the point with numbers. He says the United States produces 20 million barrels of oil a day and consumes roughly the same amount, making a Hormuz disruption a modest problem for America relative to Asia. China, by contrast, is deeply exposed. According to the figures cited on the show, 20% of China's domestic oil consumption comes from Venezuela and Iran. Gerstner then makes the stronger claim that while the arithmetic may say 20%, the functional exposure is much larger because oil underpins transport, feedstocks, and logistics across the whole economy. He also notes that China has a strategic petroleum reserve, but argues it is not sufficient to absorb 5 or 6 months of sustained disruption. The domestic political implications, he says, could be severe. He points to 25% unemployment of young men inside of China and asks what happens to that figure if oil scarcity worsens and industrial activity slows further. In his view, that is the unemployment rate Washington should really be watching. This leads to a game theory argument. The panel notes that China did not come to. Section 5, AI's revenue explosion and the end of the where is the revenue. Debate after nearly an hour of war, oil, and strategy. The discussion swings back to technology with a startling set of financial claims about OpenAI and Anthropic. The host frames it dramatically. These companies are scaling revenue and costs faster than we've ever seen in the history of business. The headline figures are meant to be jaw-dropping. Anthropic, he says, hit a $14 billion run rate in February after growing from $1 billion to $14 billion in just 14 months, a 12x year-over-year surge. OpenAI allegedly reached a $20 billion annualized run rate, growing from $2 billion to $20 billion in 24 months. Brad Gerstner, an investor in both firms, treats those numbers as proof that the debate has changed. Only 90 days ago, he says, there was tremendous skepticism that all the infrastructure spending around AI would ever produce meaningful top-line results. That skepticism has now been obliterated. His key line is that January and February represented a nuclear moment or splitting of the atom moment for AI commercialization. He offers a more specific figure that becomes the centerpiece of the conversation. Anthropic supposedly did $6 billion in a month in February, a 28-day month. Whether annualized or recognized exactly as stated, Gerstner's point is the same: the scale is unlike anything enterprise software has seen before. He compares it to Snowflake and Databricks, arguing that Anthropic may have generated in just a few months the sort of revenue that elite software companies took more than a decade to build. What is driving it, Gerstner? Section 6, Experimental Revenue or Real Production. The great AI quality debate. Chamath pushes back hardest on the triumphalism around AI revenue. He does not deny that the numbers are large, he questions what they mean. His distinction is between raw spending and durable economic value. In his framing, there is still not a single good example of sustained margin expansion across a true corporate enterprise driven by AI in a way that has become core, critical, and irreversible. Companies are spending aggressively, but many are doing so because every board expects an AI checkbox. He argues that much of today's revenue quality is weak. If tens of thousands of companies are each paying $200 per month or more for subscriptions and experimentation, enormous numbers can appear quickly. But unlike Snowflake or Databricks, whose software became embedded in revenue-generating production workflows, AI often remains in the trial phase. Healthcare, financial services, and other regulated sectors still face liability if AI makes a wrong call. In those industries, he says, the technology has not yet crossed from interesting to core critical operational workflow. His example is Amazon Web Services. According to Chamath, Amazon had several save-one incidents caused by code written by agents, enough to require a new rule that humans must review and approve AI-generated code in AWS. His point is that reliability remains the gating issue. He likes Oz because it is hyper-reliable, and that level of reliability historically came from deterministic code and disciplined human oversight. AI may help, but it is not yet trusted as an autonomous backbone. Gerstner responds with nuance rather than denial. He says he has long. Section 7, the compute bill, the J-curve, and why AI profitability is still years away even amid the revenue excitement. The hosts are clear that the economics of AI infrastructure remain brutal. The key question becomes not whether model companies can sell tokens, but how long it will take for those sales to outrun the staggering capital costs required to build the underlying systems. The host frames it with a J-curve question. If the industry ends up investing $500 billion or more, when do the large language model companies actually become profitable on a calendar year basis? Chamath provides the most concrete answer. He says he is currently building a 1-gigawatt data center in Arizona and that the economics have deteriorated sharply from his initial expectations. What he first thought would cost 4 or 5 billion rose to 10 billion, then 15 billion, then 20 billion, and is now upwards of 50 billion once land, permits, PowerShell, infrastructure, labor, and everything else are included. That figure becomes his anchor for understanding AI infrastructure economics. He pairs that cost with a revenue estimate attributed to reporting by Sarah Fryer. Each gigawatt can generate roughly 10 billion of annual revenue. On that basis, the payback period is about 5 years just to get back to break-even. Only in year 6, 7, and 8 does meaningful profit begin to appear. That is the core insight. Energy equals intelligence, but energy infrastructure is enormously expensive, and the financial return profile looks more like a utility build-out than a classic software margin story. There are, however, ways to improve the curve. Chamath says better silicon can compress the depth and. Section 8, AI's messaging crisis. Doomerism, distrust, and a PR disaster. The discussion then takes a sharp cultural turn. Chamath argues that the industry has a serious public relations problem and not by accident. He says some AI leaders have been obtesting fear in order to raise capital and shape regulation. On one end of the spectrum, he caricatures a message like, "We have a sentient super god. We're the only ones that can protect you from it, but your days are numbered." On the other end is Sam Altman's simpler framing that AI is becoming a utility, sold on a meter like electricity or water. For Chamath, the gap between those narratives is not healthy experimentation. It is chaotic, self-serving messaging that has deeply confused the public. He cites a clip from former Google CEO Eric Schmidt warning that AI could dramatically shift economic and political power, especially between different voting blocs and labor classes. Chamath's takeaway is not that Schmidt is wrong, but that the industry cannot simultaneously hype civilizational risk, sell mass automation, and then act surprised when people grow suspicious. He says a more honest message would acknowledge that much remains experimental, that regulated industries require caution, and that deployment should be methodical, reliable, and trustworthy. The polling is brutal. Chamath presents a chart showing AI's favorability just above the Democratic Party and an autocratic state, with even ICE scoring higher. Sachs reinforces the point with cross-country data, saying roughly 80% of people in China believe AI will be more beneficial than harmful, while U.S. optimism sits in the 30s and may now be lower. He argues that this is less about